81 loaves sat inside the oven, scored into 8 wedges each, exactly the way Romans liked their bread. On any ordinary day they would have been sold and eaten within hours. Instead, they stayed in that oven for 1700 years. Pompeii is not a ruin. Ruins decay slowly, and people carry away what matters. Pompeii simply stopped, mid-meal, mid-election, mid-argument, and was buried under meters of pumice and ash before the eruption was over. Everything historians can only guess about other ancient cities, this one simply shows us. This is the story of how a small town on the wrong bay became one of the most complete windows into the Roman world that has ever survived. And it begins 7 centuries before the disaster, with farming families who chose that dark, fertile soil because of the mountain above it, a mountain whose danger they did not understand. Chapter 1. The Mountain That Fed Them. Before this becomes a disaster story, it is a real estate story, and a fairly ordinary one. Somewhere around the 700s BC, a group of farming families looked at a stretch of land on the Bay of Naples and made a choice that still looks obvious today. It looked obvious to them for almost the opposite reason it looks obvious to us. They saw a bay so beautiful that the Romans would later line it with the vacation villas of senators and emperors. Calm blue water, sheltered from the open sea. A river, the Sarno, winding down from the hills to a natural harbour, and rising behind it all, a single green mountain, tall and quiet, its slopes covered in wild vines, chestnut, and oak. It did not smoke. It did not rumble. No surviving source suggests that the people who settled here understood it as an active volcano. To them, as far as we can tell, it was simply the mountain, the way a hill or a river is simply itself. And here is the first cruel twist in this story. Vesuvius had already done this before, well over 1,000 years before Pompeii existed. Back in the Bronze Age, the mountain erupted with catastrophic force, in what geologists now call the Avellino eruption. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences reconstructed what happened to the people living near it. Villages were buried in ash. Thousands of human footprints were pressed into the wet volcanic mud, and nearly all of them point away from the mountain, towards safety. At a settlement called Nola, excavators found the collapsed roofs of Bronze Age huts, preserved by the very ash that brought them down, with grinding stones and storage jars still sitting where their owners left them. Nearby, at a site called San Paolo Belsito, researchers found the remains of a young woman, curled into a self-protecting posture that researchers associate with death by suffocation. She did not get out. Most people, the footprints suggest, did. Then, over the centuries that followed, something happened that tells you a great deal about how human memory actually works. People came back, not the same people, but their descendants, and newcomers drawn by the same land. Generation after generation, no surviving tradition, no legend recorded by any later Greek or Roman writer, shows that anyone here still understood what had happened on this ground. By the time the ancestors of Pompeii arrived, the mountain had been quiet for so long that its violence was simply gone from memory. The evidence was right there under their feet. There was no one left who knew how to read it. In fact, the evidence was the reason they came. Volcanic soil is some of the richest farmland on Earth, and it is worth pausing on why. Ash and lava break down over centuries into soil packed with potassium and other minerals that ordinary Mediterranean dirt simply lacks. Every ancient eruption had loaded this plain with exactly that kind of richness, and the result was almost absurd abundance. Roman writers would later marvel at this stretch of coast, at vines that produced celebrated wine, at olives and figs and grain that seemed to grow back faster than anywhere else in Italy. The same ash that had once buried a woman at San Paolo Belsito was now, well over 1,000 years later, ripening grapes for people who had no idea what lay beneath their fields. The mountain was not a threat. The mountain was the economy. So people settled. The earliest we can name were the Oscans, an Italic people with their own language, who farmed this plain long before anyone here spoke a word of Latin. Their villages would have looked like most early Italian farming communities of the period. Clusters of simple huts with thatched roofs, grain stores raised off the ground to keep out damp and rats, small shrines set at the edges of the fields. At some point, most likely in the 600s or 700s BC, one particular settlement took shape on a very specific piece of high ground near the mouth of the Sarno, and slowly began to outgrow its neighbours. And the choice of that ground is the second cruel twist of the story. The site of Pompeii sits on a raised plateau, roughly 40 metres above sea level, with steep drops on the seaward side. It was a natural fortress, high, defensible, overlooking both the river and the harbour. It was, by every practical measure available to its first settlers, an excellent place to build. It was also, quite literally, the hardened tongue of an old lava flow from Vesuvius itself. The city that would become history's most famous volcanic victim was built on the volcano's own leftover rock. Its founders chose the spot because it was high ground. Without knowing it, they were standing on the wreckage of a previous eruption and calling it safety. Even the town's name may reach back to those first farmers. One long-standing theory connects the word Pompeii to the Oscan word for the number 5, Pompe, which could point to a community formed from 5 clans, or 5 original districts. Scholars still debate the idea, and it may never be fully settled, but it fits everything else the archaeology shows. This was not a city founded by kings or heroes. It was a practical little place, built by farming families, at the exact point where a river met the sea and the produce of that impossible soil could be loaded onto boats. A location like that does not stay secret for long. While the Oscans were planting their vines, the wider Mediterranean around them was waking up. This was the great age of movement across that sea. Ships crossing from the east, new peoples probing every coastline, hunting for metal, for markets, for land worth taking. To the north of the bay, one of those peoples had already landed, and was building something Italy had never quite seen before. In the inland hills behind them, another power was growing restless. The little farming town on the lava plateau sat exactly between them, holding the river, the harbour, and the richest soil on the coast for the next 500 years. Almost every power that mattered in Italy would want Pompeii. The first to arrive came by sea, and they came from Greece. Chapter 2. Crossroads of the Ancient Sea. There is a flaw in Pompeii that should not exist. It was found in the largest private house in the city, a mansion so grand that archaeologists named it the House of the Faun, after the small bronze dancer that still stands in its front pool. The house alone covers close to an entire city block, with 2 separate dining suites and 2 garden courtyards, built to entertain far beyond the needs of any single family. And set into the floor of its finest room was a picture made of more than 1 million tiny stones. It shows Alexander the Great at full gallop, hair flying, spear levelled, crashing into the battle line of the Persian king Darius. Darius's face is turned back toward Alexander, his expression taunts, his chariot already pulling away. Museums today treat it as one of the masterpieces of all ancient art. Scholars widely read it as a close copy of a famous Greek painting, executed by artists of real skill and no small expense. And it was not sitting in a palace. It was not in Rome, or Athens, or Alexandria. It was in the front hall of a private family, in a provincial farm town, on the Italian coast. To understand Pompeii at all, you eventually have to explain that flaw. How did this much money and this much Greek culture end up here? The answer begins with sails on the horizon. Around the time the Oscans were settling their plateau, Greek colonists were planting cities all along the coasts of southern Italy, so many of them that the Romans would later call the whole region Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. On the Bay of Naples they built some of their oldest outposts in all of Italy, first on the island of Ischia, then at Cumae, on the mainland, and later a new city nearby that they simply called Neapolis. The new city. Say Neapolis fast enough. For 2,000 years. And you get Naples. For the little Oscan town on the Sarno, the Greeks changed everything. Suddenly the produce of that volcanic soil had customers across the sea, and the harbour at the river mouth had a real job to do. Greek pottery begins appearing in Pompeii's oldest layers. So do Greek building styles. And Greek hods. One of the earliest structures ever found in the city is a Doric temple in the southern district. It was raised in the Greek manner, in the 500s BC, and it is linked by scholars to Hercules, and later to Athena, whom the locals would come to call Minerva. The ancient geographer Strabo even passed along a tradition that Hercules himself had founded Pompeii on his travels through Italy. That was legend, not history. But when a small Italian farm town wants a Greek hero for a founder, you can tell which way the cultural wind is blowing. The Greeks were not the only ones arriving. From the north came the Etruscans, the great power of central Italy, pushing south into Campania with their own towns and their own trade routes. Later, Roman writers described a whole league of Etruscan cities across this region, built on the model of Etruria itself, with Capua at its head. For roughly a century, Pompeii lived caught between two worlds. Etruscan influence pressing overland, Greek influence arriving by sea, and traces of both show up in the oldest layers of the city's sanctuaries. The rivalry finally broke in 474 BC, when Greek and Etruscan fleets met in battle off Cumae. The Greeks won. Etruscan power on this stretch of coast began to fade. So far, the story sounds almost gentle. Farmers, traders, Templars, influence flowing back and forth like the tide. Then, late in the 400s BC, the mountains behind Pompeii emptied out. Out of the Apennine highlands came the Samnites, tough, Oscan-speaking hill peoples, herders and fighters, moving down into the rich lowlands in wave after wave. Within a couple of generations they held effectively all of Campania. Greek Cuma fell to them, so did mighty Capua, and Pompeii, along with the whole Sarno Valley, became a Samnite town. These were the people who would eventually give the Roman arena one of its oldest and heaviest fighting styles. A big shield and a plumed helmet that Rome never bothered to rename. That detail matters more than it seems, and it will return. Here is what matters right now. Samnite rule was not the end of Pompeii's rise. It was the beginning of it. The Samnites spoke a language close to that of the town's original farmers, and under their rule, Pompeii kept trading with the Greek world and kept growing. You can measure the ambition of this era in stone. The city wall was extended to enclose more than 60 hectares, a huge circuit for a town this size, and much of the street grid that visitors walk today was laid out in this period. By the last century of Samnite rule, Pompeii was building on a scale that seems almost boastful. A grand temple of Apollo beside the Forum, colonnaded houses with garden courts, and that enormous mansion, the House of the Faun, with Alexander the Great galloping across its floor. That floor is the answer to our opening question. It is what 5 centuries of wine, oil, and harbour traffic looks like. Once it lands in one family's front room, by the 200s BC, this provincial town was rich enough to buy world-class art, and confident enough to walk across it every day. But while Pompeii was getting rich, the map of Italy was being redrawn by force. The Samnites had a problem, and the problem was Rome. 3 times between the 340s and the 290s BC, Rome and the Samnite peoples fought long, brutal wars for control of the spine of Italy. Roman armies were humiliated in mountain passes. Samnite armies were broken on open ground. When it finally ended, Rome had won, and every community in the region, Pompeii included, was bound to Rome as a so-called ally, obligated to supply soldiers and follow Roman foreign policy. Notice that word, ally, not citizen. It sounds like a technicality. It would eventually set Italy on fire for about 2 centuries. Though the arrangement held. Pompeii stayed Oscan speaking, ran its own affairs, and prospered quietly under Rome's shadow, even when Hannibal stormed through Italy and much of Campania went over to him. Pompeii appears to have kept its standing with Rome, though the record from those exact years is thin, and historians reason partly from silence rather than a clear account. Small places near great powers learn a survival skill early. Keep your head down. Keep the harbour busy. Let the giants exhaust each other. Then Rome asked too much, and gave too little, for 1 generation too long, and the town that had always kept its head down finally raised it. Chapter 3. Rome comes to the bay. By the 90s BC, the peoples of Italy had been Rome's allies for 200 years. They marched in Rome's legions. They bled in Rome's wars. From Spain to Greece, they watched Rome grow rich on an empire their own sons had helped conquer. What they did not have was Roman citizenship, no vote, no full legal protection, no real share of the power they kept dying for. Italian leaders asked for citizenship, politely and repeatedly. Rome refused. In 91 BC, a Roman politician named Marcus Livius Drusus proposed extending citizenship to the allies. He was murdered in his own home. That murder lit the fuse. Across the peninsula, the allies rose in open revolt, and the conflict that followed is known as the Social War. From Soci, the Latin word for allies, it remains one of the strangest wars in ancient history, because most of the rebels were not fighting to destroy Rome. In effect, they were fighting for the right to become Romans. They even organized their own rebel state, called Italia, with its own capital and its own coins. Some of those coins show the Italian bull goring the Roman wolf. Pompeii joined the rebellion. For a trading town that had spent centuries avoiding trouble, this was an extraordinary gamble, and it summoned an extraordinary enemy. In 89 BC, the Roman commander Lucius Cornelius Sulla, one of the most ruthless men the Republic ever produced, swept into Campania and laid siege to Pompeii. Here is where this story stops being something you only read and becomes something you can actually touch. The siege is still physically written on the city. Along the northern stretch of wall, near the Vesuvius gate and the Herculaneum gate, the stones are pocked and gouged where Roman artillery slammed into them. Archaeologists have mapped these impact scars. Round craters left by stone balls hurled from torsion catapults, along with patched sections where whole towers were smashed and hastily repaired. Inside the city, painted notices in the Oscan language were found near street corners, and one durable, scholarly interpretation reads them as defense instructions, directing fighters to their muster points along the walls. If that reading is right, you can still trace how the defenders of Pompeii organized, street by street, for the storm that was coming. It was not enough. The rebel armies of Campania were beaten in the field, and Pompeii's resistance ended with them. Then came the great irony of the whole war. The rebels lost the war and won the argument. Rome, shaken by how close the revolt had come to succeeding, extended citizenship to essentially all of Italy anyway. The survivors of Pompeii got, by another route, the legal prize their war had failed to win. What they also got, a decade later, was punishment with a smile. Sulla went on to win a civil war and make himself dictator of Rome, and in 80 BC he settled a colony of his veteran soldiers, numbering in the thousands by ancient accounts, on Pompeian land. The town was legally refounded as a Roman colony, under a long new official name honouring his own family and his patron goddess, Venus. Colonia Cornelia Veneria Pompeianorum. Land was confiscated for the newcomers. Latin replaced Oscan as the language of government. The old local families watched retired legionaries take the seats on their own town council. The Roman statesman Cicero, defending a client in court a couple of decades later, mentioned that the colonists and the old Pompeians had quarrelled for years over voting rules and civic standing, disputes serious enough to end up argued in a Roman courtroom. And then something familiar happened, the same thing that had already happened with the Greeks, the Etruscans, and the Samnites. Pompeii absorbed its conquerors. Within a generation or two, the two communities blurred together. Old Oscan family names start appearing attached to Roman offices. Intermarriage did what no decree could, and the town Sulla had punished began, almost embarrassingly, to thrive. Roman money discovered the Bay of Naples in a big way during the 1st century BC, and the coastline filled with the seaside villas of the powerful. Two of Sulla's own colonial officials, men named Gaius Quinctius Valgus and Marcus Porcius, paid out of their own pockets for a new stone amphitheater. Built around 70 BC, their names still survive on the building's dedication. That amphitheater stands today as the oldest stone amphitheater to survive anywhere in the Roman world, over a century older than the Colosseum in Rome. In time, a long branch aqueduct connected the city to a larger regional network, the system generally known today as the Aqua Augusta, bringing mountain water down to public fountains, bath houses, and private homes. The harbour kept moving wine, oil, and the region's famous fish sauce down the coast and across the sea. By the time Augustus ended the civil wars and became the first emperor, Pompeii had completed its long transformation. Oscan farm town, Greek trading partner, Samnite showpiece, rebel city, and now a thoroughly Roman community of perhaps 10 to 12,000 people. Comfortable, confident, and completely ordinary. Ordinary is the key word. Rome ruled hundreds of towns like this one, not famous, not powerful, just alive. And that is exactly why what comes next matters so much. When the end came, it did not preserve a palace, or a battlefield, or the kind of scene history usually bothers to keep. It preserved an ordinary Roman working day, the bakeries and the bars, the election posters, and the rude jokes on the walls. So before the mountain enters this story, let us spend one full morning in those streets while they are still crowded with the living. Hour by hour, at street level, the city is about to show us how the Roman world actually worked. Chapter 4. The City That Worked. Forget marble emperors. Come through the Marine Gate just after dawn, on an ordinary day in the 70s AD, and let the city itself do the talking. The gate sits at the top of a steep ramp from the harbour, and the first traffic of the day is already climbing it. Porters with baskets of fish, mule drivers, farmers in from the countryside with produce for the market stalls. You come out of the gate's cool tunnel into noise, iron-rimmed cartwheels grinding over stone, hammers starting up in the metal shops, shutters rattling open along the shop fronts. Look down, because the street beneath your feet is a machine. The paving is dark volcanic stone, and cutting across it at the corner ahead is a line of raised stepping stones. They are there so you can cross without putting your sandals into the wet filth below, because these streets doubled as drains, and the gaps between the stones are spaced exactly so that cartwheels can roll through. Look closer, and you can see grooves worn into the paving itself. Ruts cut by generations of wheels. Researchers who mapped those ruts and the wear on the curbstones have argued that parts of Pompeii ran a deliberate circulation system, with some narrow streets working one way only. 2,000 years before the traffic engineer existed as a profession, somebody in this town was already doing the job. Now look up, because water is moving over your head. An aqueduct branch fed a tall distribution building by the Vesuvius gate, on the high northern edge of town, and from there lead pipes ran beneath the sidewalks, to bathhouses, to wealthy private homes, and to public fountains at the street corners. Around 40 of those fountains have been counted across the city, spaced so that most residents lived within a short walk of free, clean mountain water, a permanent public water grid, in a mid-sized provincial town in the 1st century. Turn down a side street and you can hear splashing before you see it. One of the city's public bath complexes is already open, coal smoke rising from the furnace room that heats its floors and walls from below. Men and women often bathe on separate schedules or in separate wings, moving through a sequence of rooms, cold, warm, and hot, that any modern spa would still recognize. Bathing here was not a luxury reserved for the rich. It was a daily habit, cheap enough for almost anyone, and bathhouses like this one brought together a remarkably broad range of urban society, though status and wealth still shaped every part of the experience. From which hours you came to, who scrubbed your back, and who did the scrubbing. Follow the smell of baking bread instead, and you arrive at a working bakery, one of dozens identified across the city. In the back, heavy lava stone mills stand in a row, shaped like giant hourglasses, built to be turned by donkeys walking in slow circles, grinding grain into flour a few feet from the oven where the loaves went in. Bread was the engine of the Roman diet, and Pompeii baked its own, block by block, all across the city. But here is a detail that surprises most people. This city ate out constantly. Along the main streets you pass one snack bar after another, masonry counters facing the sidewalk, with big ceramic jars set into the countertop for serving food and drink. Archaeologists call them thermopolia, and estimates commonly run to around 80 of them across the excavated city alone. Many modest homes had only limited cooking facilities, so for a large share of the population, street food was not a treat. It was daily infrastructure. One of these bars, excavated in the Regio 5 district and presented by the Archaeological Park of Pompeii in 2019 and 2020, still had its counter painted with bright images. A sea nymph riding a seahorse, a roaster, dogs on leashes. Foods identified inside its storage jars included traces of duck, pork, goat, fish, and snails. A 2,000-year-old menu, still readable today. Everything on that menu wanted one particular condiment, garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans splashed onto practically everything. And this coast produced some of the most celebrated garum in the whole empire. One local businessman, Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, got seriously rich on it. We know his name because his product jars carry it, and because the floor of his grand house features mosaic pictures of his own garum containers, labelled with boasts about their quality. A man who loved his brand so much that he tiled it into his own floor. And commerce was not the only thing announcing itself, because as the morning crowds thicken, you start to notice the walls themselves are talking, painted in confident red letters. On house fronts and street corners are the election notices. Every year the town voted for its magistrates, and campaign season covered Pompeii in advertising. Scholars have recorded well over 2,000 of these painted appeals across the city. The formulas repeat, block after block. So-and-so is a good man, worthy of public office. Vote for him. Professional sign painters produced them, sometimes working at night by lamplight, and a few of them even signed their work. Trade groups endorsed candidates as whole blocks. The fruit sellers back this man. The mule drivers support that one. Some endorsements read like sabotage wearing a smile. Notices survive announcing that the late-night drinkers support a certain candidate, or that the petty thieves do. Scholars still debate whether these were genuine jokes from supporters, or mockery planted by rivals. Either way, look at what is on these walls. Interest group politics. Attack ads. Get out the vote messaging. 20 centuries before television existed to carry any of it. One detail stays with me more than any other. Those campaigns were still live. Fresh notices for upcoming races were still bright on the walls when the city died. Pompeii was not preserved as a finished monument. It was preserved mid-election, mid-argument, mid-morning. A machine stopped with every gear still engaged. And a machine like this runs on people, not the consuls and generals the history books love, bakers, barmaids, bunkers, priestesses, slaves. The city preserved them too. It preserved something almost no other place on earth has managed to keep. It preserved their handwriting. Chapter 5. The People on the Walls. If I could keep only one thing from Pompeii, it would not be the temples or the mosaics. It would be the graffiti. Thousands of scratched and painted messages have been documented on walls all over this city, recorded by scholars in the great corpus of Latin inscriptions, written not by authors or officials, but by anyone with a stylus and an opinion. This is the one place where the ancient world talks to us in its own casual, unfiltered voice. And what does that voice say? Almost exactly what we say. People wrote love notes. The same tender formula appears again and again across the city. A man greeting his girl by name, calling her his sweetest, wishing her well. People wrote heartbreak. One catalogued inscription is a furious complaint against Venus herself, the goddess of love. in which the writer threatens to beat her for breaking his heart. People bragged about their conquests. In language, I will politely leave in Latin. They complained about their neighbours. They scratched out alphabets, most likely children practicing their letters. They quoted poetry, and the opening line of Virgil's Aeneid shows up repeatedly across the city, the way everyone today knows one line of a famous song without ever having studied it. Fans drew gladiators with tallies of their wins, and painted inscriptions celebrate the stars of the arena by name. One fighter hailed with a phrase scholars translate along the lines of the girl's heartthrob. At one bar, a customer scratched a complaint that has been delighting historians ever since, accusing the landlord of selling watered-down wine while drinking the good stuff himself. And in one much scribbled hallway, someone wrote a joke about the graffiti itself, marvelling that the wall had not yet collapsed under the sheer weight of so much scribbling. Yes, they had graffiti complaining about graffiti. Read enough of these and something shifts in you. 20 centuries of distance thins out to almost nothing. These were not marble people. They were people. Now, let us meet a few of them by name, because Pompeii allows that too. Start with Eumakia, a woman, in a world where women could not vote or hold office, yet one of the largest buildings on the entire forum carries her name. A great columned building long associated with the city's textile trades, though its precise function is still debated among historians. She was a public priestess from a family with interests in wine and brick, and she paid for the building out of her own fortune, dedicating it in her own name and her son's. The Fullers, the powerful guild of cloth workers, raised a statue to her in thanks, and it survives to this day. The election notices tell a similar story from below, because dozens of them show women publicly endorsing candidates, wielding an influence the law never officially granted them. Eumakia could not cast a single vote of her own, so she bought a place on the skyline of her city instead. Power finds a door. Then there is Julia Felix, who understood real estate. She owned a large property near the amphitheater, complete with gardens, a bath suite, and rows of shops. And at some point she converted the whole estate into what we would now call a mixed-use development. We know because her advertisement was found painted outside, offering elegant baths, shops, and upstairs apartments for rent, on a lease running 5 years. A businesswoman's billboard, preserved letter by letter for 2,000 years. Then the banker, Lucius Caecilius Jucundus, in whose house excavators found a strongbox archive of over 150 wax tablets, receipts, auction records, loans, commission, each one witnessed and signed. Through one financier's paperwork you can watch the actual money of a Roman town move. Who owed what to whom? Women doing business alongside men. Enslaved agents handling transactions on behalf of their owners. An ordinary filing cabinet that quietly outlived the Roman Empire. And everywhere, once you learn to look, are the people who owned nothing, including themselves. Enslaved people formed an essential, and by most scholarly estimates substantial, part of this city's labour force. They cooked in those snack bars, hauled cargo up from the harbour, ground the flour, raised the children of the rich. Pompeii preserves their world too, in the cramped service corridors that run behind the frescoed dining rooms, and in 2021, at a villa just outside the city at Civita Juliana, the archaeological park announced the excavation of a small room it described as quarters for the enslaved, furnished with simple beds, a chamber pot, and basic work gear. No painted nymphs, no mosaic floor, 3 beds, and 1 small window set high in the wall. Yet Roman slavery had a strange escape hatch, and Pompeii shows that side of it as well. Freed slaves, called freedmen, became citizens, and some of them became genuinely wealthy. The House of the Veti, one of the most lavishly painted houses in the entire city, is widely believed to have belonged to 2 freedmen, most likely brothers, who made a fortune, quite possibly in the wine trade. If that reading is right, 2 men who began life as property ended it, surrounded by mythological frescoes fit for aristocrats. Their walls make the announcement no inscription ever needed to spell out, "Look what we became." That was Pompeii at street level. Loud, commercial, unequal, funny, ambitious, alive, 10,000 stories and more, all running at once, in a town that was certain of its own tomorrows. In 59 AD, one of those stories briefly made Pompeii notorious across all of Italy. It had nothing to do with the mountain. It happened in the Amphitheater, on a games day, and it turned ugly enough to reach the desk of the Emperor Nero himself. Chapter 6. Blood in the Amphitheater. Every Roman town had a rival. For Pompeii it was Nuceria, a neighbouring city about 10 miles inland, close enough to share a road, a market, and a grudge that nobody now can fully explain. Land disputes, trade rivalry, perhaps resentment after Nero settled new colonists at Nuceria a few years earlier. We do not know exactly where the bad blood started. What we know is how it exploded, because the historian Tacitus recorded it in his annals, and because Pompeii itself kept a picture of the day. The games that year were being hosted by a man named Lavinius Regulus, a former senator who had himself been expelled from the Senate not long before. Spectators streamed in from the whole region, including a large crowd from Nuceria, and Pompeii's stone amphitheatre, the very one that Valgus and Porcius had built more than a century earlier, filled with spectators from both towns and the countryside around them. The building carried an old echo that day, one nobody in the crowd would have thought twice about. The heaviest and most traditional class of gladiator still fighting in Roman arenas traced its shield, its helmet, and its whole fighting style back to the Samnite warriors who had once ruled this valley. The same people this story met a few chapters ago. Rome had a habit of turning yesterday's enemy into tomorrow's spectacle, and nowhere was that habit more visible than in a stadium built to entertain the grandchildren of people whose own grandparents had fought a war against the ancestors of the men now paid to fight for their amusement. It began, Tacitus says, with taunts, small-town insults flying back and forth between Pompeians and Nucerians, the kind of thing crowds have done in every century since, sharpened by the heat and the noise and the tension of a packed games day. Then stones started flying, then weapons came out, a sports crowd became a battle, and inside their own home arena, the Pompeians had overwhelming numbers on their side. Tacitus reports that many Nucerians were carried home maimed, their bodies torn, and that parents in Nuceria mourned children who had gone to watch a show and never came home. Not bruised fans, dead ones. The scandal travelled all the way to Rome. Nero referred the matter to the Senate, which sent its own members south to investigate on the spot. And the sentence that eventually came down tells you exactly what Romans judged would hurt a city like this the most. Not executions of the guilty, not the town's destruction. Pompeii was forbidden to hold gatherings of that kind for 10 full years, a punishment that effectively silenced its arena for a decade. The unofficial fan associations, the sodalitia, that had helped organize the crowd were formally dissolved. Lavinius Regulus and the other officials judged responsible for the violence were sent into exile. A stadium ban, a crackdown on the organized supporters, the banishment of the men in charge. If the shape of that punishment feels strangely modern, it should. Rome had crowd control figured out 19 centuries before we did. To feel the true weight of that sentence, remember what the amphitheater meant to this particular town. This was a place so devoted to the arena that fans scratched gladiators' win records into the plaster, where fighters were celebrities with their own painted fan mail on the walls. The building itself was civic pride poured into stone, raised by two of the town's own founding officials, older than anything Rome itself could show, and by order of the Senate, it simply went dark, year after year. Now for the strangest part of this whole episode. In a house near the amphitheater, excavators found a fresco showing the riot itself. Not a mythological battle, not a scene from Homer. This specific event, the amphitheater, is painted in careful detail. Its outer staircases, its awnings, the open ground beside it where market stalls once stood, and scattered everywhere across the painting, tiny figures fighting, in the seats, on the arena floor, in the streets outside the walls. Someone in Pompeii considered the bloodiest scandal in the town's recent history important enough to preserve on the wall of their own home. Its composition has often been read as celebratory rather than apologetic, though the owner's true intention cannot be recovered with any certainty. That fresco is also a quiet gift to history, because it may be a rare surviving depiction of a specific, historically recorded crowd event from the ancient world, painted by someone who could simply walk outside and check the details against the real building next door. There is evidence the 10-year ban did not run its full course. Many scholars believe it was lifted early, quite possibly after the disaster of 62 AD, when the town suddenly needed comfort far more than it needed punishment. And that word, disaster, is where this story turns. Because while Pompeians and Nucerians were spilling blood over seats and civic pride, every single person in that amphitheater was ignoring the only rivalry that actually mattered, the one between their city and the quiet green mountain 5 miles away. In the early 60s AD, that mountain finally moved. Chapter 7. The warning nobody understood. It came on an ordinary day in early February, in either 62 or 63 AD. Our two best ancient sources disagree on the exact year by one. The ground under the Bay of Naples began to shake, hard, and by the time it stopped, Pompeii was half wrecked. We have a remarkable witness for this earthquake, though he watched it from a distance, the philosopher Seneca, an advisor to the Emperor Nero, wrote about it almost immediately. In a book called Natural Questions, he reports that Pompeii was largely ruined, that neighbouring Herculaneum was partly destroyed, and that damage reached as far as Naples itself. He also passes along strange details from the countryside: a flock of hundreds of sheep found dead, statues split apart, people wondrous out of their minds with shock. The sheep detail stayed with him, and he tried to explain it. He suggested that tainted air, rising from some deep place in the earth, had poisoned them, air from below, where, in his telling, something was simply wrong. Seneca was one of the most brilliant men of his age, and across those pages he devotes a long section to a genuinely serious question: what force moves solid ground? His best answer involved winds and vapours trapped inside underground caverns, straining to escape. It is not a foolish theory for its time. It is simply the wrong one, what he never wrote, What nobody in the ancient world wrote down was the one sentence that might have changed everything 17 years later. That mountain is a volcano, and it may be dangerous. Could anyone have written it? Be careful here, because the honest answer is a humbling one, even today. Scientists debate exactly how that earthquake relates to what came later. Some researchers read it as part of the region's volcanic unrest, the deep system beneath Vesuvius stirring back to life. Others point out that Campania is seismically active in its own right, with faults that have nothing to do with the volcano, and argue the quake needs no volcanic explanation at all. The relationship may never be fully settled, and if anything, that uncertainty deepens the tragedy rather than softening it. This was not a clear warning that foolish people simply chose to ignore. It was an ambiguous signal that even modern science, with every instrument at its disposal, still argues about. The people of Pompeii never had a real chance to read it correctly. They translated it the only way their world allowed them to. Bad luck, or angry gods. So Pompeii did what humans have always done after a disaster they believe is random. It grieved. It cleared the rubble. And it rebuilt. And here the archaeology becomes genuinely fascinating. Because the later eruption preserved not a finished city, but a city still in the middle of renovation. And you can still read those 17 years of repair work, frozen in place. Fresh walls patched into cracked ones. Rooms redecorated in the newest fashion. Right beside rooms still stripped bare and waiting their turn. One rebuilding story survives in unusual detail. The Temple of Isis, an Egyptian sanctuary popular in this cosmopolitan harbour town, had collapsed in the quake, and an inscription records that it was completely rebuilt at private expense by a man named Numerius Popidius Ampliatus, on behalf of his 6-year-old son, Numerius Popidius Celsinus. Ampliatus was a freedman, and freedmen were barred from holding public office. His son, however, was freeborn, in gratitude. The town council admitted the 6-year-old into their own order without the usual fee. An extraordinary civic honour, arranged almost certainly by a father who could never have held that honour himself. It is, in miniature, the entire ambition of this city. Money buying a family a door into a world its father could never legally enter. The great temple of Venus, patron goddess of the whole colony, was apparently still under reconstruction on the city's final day. Parts of the water system were found under repair as well, and some scholars have suggested the supply may have been reduced during the final period, though the digging, the pipes, and the patchwork could just as easily reflect earthquake damage. Ongoing construction, or simple routine maintenance. The city was full of scaffolding, stacked roof tiles, and wet plaster. Whatever the walls had suffered, the people living among them were betting on a future. Some researchers go further and read a social shuffle into these rebuilding years. Fine houses converted into workshops and commerce. Old families possibly leaving. New money possibly moving up. In the same pattern that built the Temple of Isis, others see not decline, but a boom town busily reinventing itself. The picture is genuinely debated. What nobody debates is the energy. On its very last day, Pompeii was a construction site. One image from those years says everything at once. In the house of the banker Caecilius Jucundus, whose wax tablets we opened 2 chapters ago, the household shrine holds 2 small marble reliefs, and they appear to show the earthquake itself. The temple of Jupiter in the forum tilting sideways, the area by the Vesuvius gate and its water tower buckling, buildings caught in mid-collapse, carved carefully into stone. Whoever commissioned those reliefs had lived through the shaking and chose to remember it, quite possibly as an act of thanks to the household gods for having survived it. It is a strange kind of gratitude, when you think about it. A family thanking the gods for surviving the first warning, in a house that would not survive the second, immeasurably worse. Born of the very same restless ground, they carved the warning and set it on their own altar, and they had no way of knowing it was a warning at all. By 79 AD, the recovery had real momentum. The arena was hosting crowds again. The painted election notices were fresh. A tradition preserved in later sources mentions another tremor in February of that final year. Noted, absorbed, and dismissed like all the others before it. Summer ripened toward harvest season. The wine presses were being readied. The big storage jars were filling with new vintage. Pompeii had survived Greeks and Etruscans and Samnites, Suya's catapults, a stadium massacre judged by the Roman Senate, and an earthquake that had broken half its walls. Every enemy across its long history had given the city a chance to fight, to bargain, or to rebuild. The next one would leave it less than a day. Chapter 8. The Last Morning. Start with a question that sounds simple, and turns out not to be. What day was it? For centuries, everyone knew the answer. The 24th of August, 79 AD. That date comes down to us from the letters of Pliny the Younger, our only surviving written eyewitness account, copied and recopied by hand across more than 1,000 years before the printing press existed. But the medieval manuscripts disagree with each other. Different copies preserve different dates, and the ground itself kept quietly arguing with August. Excavators found braziers set out as if for heating, autumn fruits, pomegranates and walnuts. Among the food remains, garments on some of the victims that a number of researchers have read as better suited to cooler weather than an August afternoon. Large storage jars already sealed with new wine, as if the grape harvest had already come in weeks before. Then, in 2018, in the freshly excavated Regio 5 district, archaeologists found a casual line of charcoal writing on a wall, dated to what corresponds to the 17th of October, with no year attached. Charcoal is fragile. It rarely survives long once exposed to open air. The archaeological park of Pompeii argued the note was almost certainly written in 79 itself, which would mean the city was still alive and scribbling in the middle of October. Many scholars now lean toward an eruption date in late October. Others still defend the traditional August date. The debate remains genuinely open, and I will not pretend to close it here. What matters most is what happened, and on the sequence of that, the letters and the ground agree with each other remarkably well. It was around midday, or early in the afternoon, when the world changed. Across the bay at Misenum, roughly 18 miles away, a 17-year-old boy was sitting with his books. His name was Pliny too, the same name as his uncle, the famous naturalist. Decades later, at the request of the historian Tacitus, he would write down what his family saw and did over the following hours, in 2 letters that scientists still read today, side by side with the volcanic deposits themselves, layer by layer. His account and the ground tell the same story. In the days before, the earth had been restless. Pliny mentions that tremors were felt beforehand, and that nobody worried much, because tremors were simply a familiar part of life in Campania. What individual households across Pompeii made of the shaking on that final morning, we cannot know. The pattern of the previous 17 years suggests an answer anyway. Shaking was weather. You waited it out and went back to work. Then the mountain's seal finally failed. Vesuvius did not erupt the way films love to show it, with slow rivers of glowing lava creeping down a hillside. It detonated. Magma, charged with compressed gas, blasted through the summit and rose as a column of ash. Pumice, and shattered rock, driven upward with almost unimaginable force. The boy across the bay reached for the best comparison his world could offer. A Mediterranean pine tree, he wrote, a great trunk of cloud climbing straight up, then spreading out flat into branches at the top. Modern volcanologists estimate the column climbed on the order of 20 miles into the sky, well into the stratosphere. They later honored the teenager's plain description by naming this entire class of eruption Plinian. Geography made its choice almost immediately. The wind that day blew toward the southeast. Herculaneum, sitting west of the volcano, watched the column rise and received, at first, almost nothing at all. Pompeii sat directly downwind. By the middle of the afternoon, day switched off over the city. The clouds swallowed the sun, and out of that sudden darkness, pumice began to fall. Pumice itself is frothed volcanic glass, filled with trapped gas bubbles. Light enough to float on water, it fell mostly in pieces the size of gravel, from miles overhead. By the trillion, researchers studying the deposits estimate it piled up at a rate of roughly 6 inches an hour. Hour after hour after hour, without a pause. Here is only what the evidence actually supports. No more. The streets are filling like sand in an hourglass. Roofs are loading up with stone, and the flatter ones begin to fail under the weight. Timber cracking, plaster raining down into the rooms below. The air is grit and dust. The light is gone. The ground keeps trembling underfoot, and in house after house across the city, families face the same decision, the one on which every remaining life in this story will turn. Go, or stay. Thousands went. This is one of the most important corrections that modern archaeology has made to the old legend of Pompeii. The city's population was likely 10,000 or more, and the human remains recovered across more than 2 centuries of digging number far fewer, commonly sighted at around 1100 within the excavated area, even allowing for the unexcavated third of the city, and for those who died out on the roads. The arithmetic points one way. Most of the population appears to have fled early, out through the gates, toward New Syria, toward the sea. During the hours when escape was terrifying but still genuinely possible, skeletal clusters have turned up near several of the gates at once. The Herculaneum Gate, the New Syria Gate, the Vesuvius Gate, evidence that people scattered in more than one direction rather than all rushing for a single exit. People from households just like the ones this story has already met. Bankers, merchants, freedmen, labourers, the enslaved, faced that same choice that afternoon, at the same moment, under the same falling sky. We cannot say which of them made it out and which did not. We can only say the choice itself did not care who you were. And the ones who stayed, here the honest historian has to slow all the way down. They may have stayed for many different reasons. Age, illness, small children who could not walk fast or far, a duty to someone who could not be moved, enslavement, and orders to guard a house that was not theirs to leave, or simply the entirely reasonable belief that solid walls beat falling stone from the sky, which is, after all, what shelter has meant for most of human history. In most individual cases, we simply cannot know which of these it was. What we can say with confidence is that staying indoors was not foolishness. It was the correct answer to the wrong question. Around midnight, the question changed completely. The column that had stood over the mountain for some 12 hours, holding an almost unthinkable weight of rock aloft on pure upward thrust, began to stagger under its own mass. And what volcanology teaches us about that particular moment is simple and terrible. The deadliest thing an eruption column ever does is not rise. It is fall. Chapter 9. The Night of the Surges. When an eruption column collapses, it does not drift back down the way ash drifts from a bonfire. It avalanche. The mixture of superheated gas, ash, and rock, suddenly too heavy to stay airborne, falls back onto the volcano's own shoulders and races outward along the ground. It is a dense, boiling current, moving at highway speed and sometimes far beyond it, hot enough to char solid wood on contact. Volcanologists call these pyroclastic flows and surges. In 79 AD, they had no name at all, because as far as the surviving record tells us, no one in the entire Mediterranean world had ever watched one arrive and lived long enough to describe it. The first collapses, around midnight and after, sent surges rolling down the western slopes. This is where Herculaneum re-enters the story. All through the afternoon, that small seaside town had escaped the pumice rain almost entirely, and its people had time that Pompeii did not. Most seemed to have used it well. The excavated town held remarkably few victims for decades, and for a long time scholars genuinely wondered whether Herculaneum had somehow emptied out completely before disaster struck. Then, in the 1980s, excavation finally reached the ancient shoreline, buried well inland by later eruptions, and there were the boathouses, stone chambers built to store fishing boats, and in them, skeletons by the dozens, eventually numbering around 300 people, crowded together under the arches at the water's edge. The physical anthropologist Sarah Bezel led the first detailed study of these remains, measuring bones worn down by decades of hard, physical work. One set of remains stood out. It carried military-style equipment and a small kit of tools, and some researchers have suggested this person may have been connected to an organized rescue effort, though his exact identity and role remain uncertain and still debated. The people sheltering in those boathouses had chosen what must have seemed the safest direction available to them: the sea, the one road the mountain could not close. They appear to have been waiting through the night, quite possibly for rescue boats that never reached the shore in time. The surge came down the slope and crossed the town in moments. Studies of the remains point to death from extreme heat, and researchers have long debated exactly how that heat killed so fast, whether by instant, catastrophic thermal shock, or by a faster but still ordinary combination of heat and suffocation. The debate continues in the scientific literature today. What nobody now disputes is the speed. The town behind those boathouses was buried by flow after flow, ultimately under some 65 feet of volcanic material that hardened like rock, sealing wooden furniture, food, and an entire library in an airless tomb. Remember that library. It returns before this story ends. Across the bay at Misenum, that same night was unravelling in its own way. In his second letter, the younger Pliny describes tremors so violent that carts standing on level ground would not stay still, rolling back and forth even when wedged with stones. He describes the sea pulled far back from the shore, stranding marine creatures on the newly exposed sand. He describes a monstrous black cloud, split apart by flashes he compares to enormous, jagged lightning. By morning, He and his mother joined a panicked crowd fleeing the town on foot, and darkness overtook them on the open road. Not the darkness of a cloudy night, he is careful to specify, but the darkness of a sealed room with the lamp put out. Around him he heard a whole city losing itself in the dark. Children calling for parents, parents shouting for children, voices trying to find each other by sound alone, since sight had stopped working entirely, and he set down one of the bleakest lines to survive from the ancient world. Some people prayed for death out of sheer terror, he wrote, and many others concluded that the gods were gone, and that this single night would simply never end. He was 18 miles from the crater. That was the good seat. At Pompeii. Sometime in the small hours, the pumice fall finally slackened. We cannot know how those still sheltering inside the city read that change. It is entirely possible some of them read it as the storm finally passing. The deposits tell us what it actually was. The earlier surges rolling toward Pompeii had weakened before doing their worst, and one appears to have stalled out close to the northern walls. Close enough to feel like a warning, not close enough to kill. Then, near dawn, came a collapse on a scale larger than anything before it, and a surge crossed the walls and moved through the streets, with more behind it in quick succession. For anyone still in the open, or crouched behind locked doors, the event was measured in moments, not minutes. In a garden near the Nuceria Gate, excavators later found a cluster of 13 people together, men, women, and children, apparently caught in the open while moving toward the edge of the city, a group now known simply as the Garden of the Fugitives. Skeletal studies published in the scientific literature point to the surges as the direct cause of death in these final hours, through some combination of extreme heat, asphyxiation, and collapsing structures, and researchers still debate the exact balance among those three causes. On the question of speed, there is no real debate left. This was not a slow burial. It was over in moments. The bodies came to rest wherever the moment found them, and then the ash performed the strangest single act of preservation in the whole history of archaeology. Fine, hot, and slightly damp, it packed itself tightly around each body and hardened. Over time the flesh decayed away, and the skeleton remained inside a sealed hollow, a negative impression that preserves much of the body's final position. 18 centuries later, an archaeologist would realize exactly what could be done with those hollows. We will stand beside him soon. One detail from the excavations, and I will simply let it speak for itself without further comment. Among the victims found along the roads and near the city gates, a number were carrying their own house keys. By the second afternoon, it was over. At Misenum, Pliny describes the darkness finally thinning, a weak and sickly yellow sun breaking through, and every familiar landscape transformed beyond recognition. Buried under deep grey drifts like some horrifying parody of snow, where Pompeii had stood, there was now a steaming plain of pumice, meters deep, pierced only by the broken stumps of upper walls and columns. The coastline itself had shifted outward. The harbour town no longer even touched the sea. Rome responded as best it could. The Emperor Titus, in the first months of his reign, sent senior officials south to organize relief, and ancient sources record that funds, including the estates of victims who died without heirs, were directed toward the recovery of Campania. It changed nothing that mattered here. There was no city left to relieve. 2 towns were gone, and in the middle of all that dying, one more story had been unfolding out on the open water. A Roman admiral had turned his ships directly toward the eruption, not away from it. He happened to be the most famous scholar in the entire Roman world. He did not come back. Chapter 10. The Man Who Sailed Toward It. On the afternoon the column first rose. The most learned man in the Roman Empire was sitting across the bay, surrounded by a library. His name was Gaius Plinius Secundus. History remembers him as Pliny the Elder. He was 55 years old, a former cavalry officer, a friend of emperors, and the author of the Natural History, an encyclopedia in 37 books that attempted something close to madness. A complete record of everything the Roman world claimed to know. Stars, storms, elephants, medicina, painting, metals, bias. He worked on it constantly and obsessively, having books read aloud to him in the bath, in the carriage, over dinner, because he considered any hour spent without learning something to be an hour simply wasted. And in 79 AD he held a very practical post as well. He commanded the imperial fleet stationed at Misenum, on the northern arm of the bay, one of Rome's principal permanent naval bases in the western Mediterranean, which means that on the last day of Pompeii, the Roman navy in those waters happened to be commanded by a working scientist. His nephew's first letter records what happened inside that household, and the sequence is almost unbearable in its sheer ordinariness. Early afternoon, the admiral's sister notices a cloud of strange size and shape rising over the mountains across the bay, and calls him over to look. He climbs to a viewpoint, studies the cloud for a while, and reacts exactly as the author of the Natural History would be expected to react. He calls for a light, fast vessel. He wants a closer look at the phenomenon, purely as a scholar. He even invites his 17-year-old nephew along for the trip. The boy declines, saying he has studying to finish. It may be the single most consequential homework excuse ever recorded, because the student who chose to stay home became the witness who wrote everything else down. As the admiral was leaving the house, a message reached him from a woman named Rectina, whose villa sat at the very foot of the mountain, and whose only way out now depended entirely on the water. She was begging for rescue, and with that message, according to his nephew, the whole mission changed shape. What had begun as a scholar's curiosity became a naval operation. Pliny ordered out the larger warships and set a course not away from the eruption, but straight toward the shore beneath it, hoping to take off Rectina and as many others as the coast could give him. His nephew preserved the spirit of that hour in a single exchange. The helmsman advised turning back. The admiral answered with an old Latin proverb about fortune favouring the bold, and held his course anyway. Those crews rode straight into it, ash sifting down onto the decks, then pumice, then stones blackened and split by fire, the water thickening with floating debris, the shallows rising fast where the seabed itself was shifting beneath them. The letter records that landing anywhere near Rectina's stretch of coast proved impossible, so Pliny turned south instead, toward Stabia, a few miles beyond Pompeii, where his friend Pomponianus had a villa by the water, and ships already loaded for escape, pinned uselessly in harbour by the same onshore wind that had carried the admiral in so quickly. What Pliny did next has been argued over for 19 centuries. He did not press further on, and he did not panic. He embraced his terrified friend, asked for a proper bath, and then sat down to dinner. He was either genuinely calm or performing calm to steady an entire frightened household. And when you happen to be the ranking Roman official on the scene, those two things may amount to exactly the same duty. As fires glowed on the mountainside through the night, he assured the household that these were only villages burning, abandoned by their owners. Then he went to bed. His snoring, the letter notes with almost comic precision, was audible from the corridor outside his room. It is the strangest detail in the whole account, and one of the most believable. A heavy man of 55, genuinely exhausted, asleep inside a catastrophe. By deep night, the courtyard outside his room was filling with ash and pumice so quickly that waiting any longer would have meant never opening the door at all. The household woke him, and together they held the exact counsel that every disaster film since has restaged in one form or another. Stay under roofs that shuddered with every fresh quake, or go out into the open under the falling stones. They chose the open, tying pillows over their heads for makeshift helmets. Down at the shore they found the sea still wild, offering nothing, and there on the beach at Stabia, in the darkness of the second day, Pliny the Elder lay down on a spread sail and asked, again and again, for cold water. Then flames and the sharp smell of sulphur announced that the mountain's currents had finally reached Stabiae itself, and the group fled. 2 slaves helped the admiral to his feet. He collapsed immediately and died there on the open beach. His nephew, reporting what survivors later told him, wrote that the thick, foul air had most likely overwhelmed a man whose breathing had never been especially strong. Some modern scholars suspect his heart simply gave out under the strain. The letter adds that when full daylight finally returned, his body was found whole and fully clothed, looking, in his nephew's own words, more like a man asleep than a man dead. So ended the author of the natural history, killed by the very nature he had spent his life cataloguing, within sight of the greatest natural event of his age, in the middle of an attempt to carry other people out of it. How many were actually saved by the ships he sent? The record simply does not say. What the record does preserve is the attempt itself, and it stands today as one of the earliest surviving accounts of an organized rescue effort mounted in the face of a volcanic eruption. A fleet, ordered straight into the ashfall, because someone on a burning shore had asked for help. The real reason this chapter matters, though, is what happened about 27 years later. The historian Tacitus, assembling his history of the era, wrote to the nephew asking how the famous uncle had actually died. The younger Pliny answered with the 2 letters we have been following all night. First, the uncle's story. Then, at Tacitus's own request, his own story too. The pine-shaped column, the sea pulled back, the darkness of a sealed room, a whole city praying for the end of the world. He closed his letters with something close to an apology, saying such personal material was hardly the stuff of proper history. He was wrong, in the most spectacular way any author has ever been wrong. Those 2 letters became the foundational eyewitness texts for the entire scientific study of explosive eruptions. When volcanologists today speak of a Plinian eruption, the most violent class there is, they are quietly honoring a 17-year-old who stayed home to study, and who later wrote down what he saw with unusual precision and little reliance on supernatural explanation. Modern researchers have tested his account against the deposits, the timing, the column height, the collapse phases, and found the boy's observations broadly consistent with the physical evidence after 19 centuries of scrutiny. One family, in one single night, gave history both of its Plinies. The uncle who sailed toward the mountain and died on its shore, the nephew who watched from across the water and became its voice. Then the voice fell silent. The letters went into the archives. The ash finally cooled, and the wider world began the long, slow work of forgetting that Pompeii had ever existed at all. Chapter 11. 17 Centuries of Silence. The forgetting did not happen all at once. That is the strange part. Pompeii was lost gradually, the way a name slips quietly out of a family, one generation simply failing to repeat it to the next. In the first years after the eruption, the site was anything but abandoned. The stumps of walls and columns still broke the surface of the grey plain, marking where things lay just beneath, and people came digging. Survivors, presumably, hunting for their own strongboxes and their own dead. Salvage crews, official or otherwise, tunneling down through the hardened ash into buildings they still remembered, stripping out marble, bronze, statuary, anything worth the considerable labour. Archaeologists keep finding their tunnels even today. In one spot, a digger who broke through into a buried house left a scrawl on the wall that translates roughly as house dugout. A salvager's tag, or perhaps a looter's, marking a job already done. Whole sections of the forum's grandest buildings appear to have been emptied of their finest stone this way. In a strange sense, the first excavation of Pompeii began within living memory of its own death. Then the tunnels stopped. The generation that still remembered where things were buried simply died off. Vesuvius erupted again and again across the centuries that followed, adding fresh layers, reshaping its own summit each time. The empire that Pompeii had belonged to cracked, converted to a new religion, and finally collapsed under its own weight. Over the dead city, the land went back to doing what it had always done best: farming. Vines grew in soil enriched by the very eruption that had buried it. Directly above streets, nobody could see anymore. The spot kept a faint ghost of a name, a low rise the locals came to call Lascivita. The city, though no one alive could any longer say which city, or why. Farmers turned up old bricks in their fields and simply shrugged, and far away, in the libraries of Europe, monks copied and recopied Pliny's letters by hand, faithfully preserving a perfect description of the death of a place that no living person could point to on a map. 12,000 lives or more. 6 centuries of history, one of the busiest small harbours in Campania, all of it reduced, eventually, to a rumour beneath a vineyard. We like to believe that cities are how civilizations remember themselves. Pompeii is proof that even a city can simply be forgotten. The first crack in that silence came by pure accident, and it came through water. At the very end of the 1500s, an Italian engineer named Domenico Fontana was cutting an underground channel to carry the Sarno's water toward a nobleman's millworks, and his tunnel happened to pass straight through the buried city. His workmen struck ancient walls, painted plaster, and inscriptions still legible after more than 15 centuries underground. His tunnel crossed the past without recognizing it. The discovery did not lead to the site's identification, and it led to no systematic excavation of any kind. The channel was finished on schedule, the finds were noted in passing, and the site went back to sleep for well over a century. It stands today as one of history's great missed appointments. Europe simply was not curious yet, not in the right way. By the 1700s, it finally was. The Kingdom of Naples had an ambitious new Bourbon ruler named Charles, a court hungry for prestige, and an age newly and passionately in love with antiquity. The first great discovery came not at Pompeii but nearby, under the town of Resina, where well diggers kept hauling up worked marble from far below the surface. In 1738, royal excavations began tunneling down through 65 feet of solid volcanic rock. A military engineer named Roque Joaquin de Alcubierre directed the work at first. What the tunnels struck was the buried theatre of Herculaneum, still standing, still decorated, its statues waiting in the dark like actors long after the house lights had gone out. 10 years later, in 1748, the crews turned their attention to the mound called La Civita and began to dig there as well. Slowly, find by find, the identification firmed up. An inscription unearthed in 1763 finally settled the question beyond doubt. Nearly 17 centuries after its burial, the city had its name back, Pompeii. Now, honesty requires a hard word about what this first century of digging actually was. It was not archaeology. It was treasure hunting with royal paperwork attached. The Bourbon operations, at times directed by military engineers and worked by convict labour, tunnelled straight towards statues, frescoes, and precious objects. They cut the finest pieces out of the walls for the king's private collection and left considerable damage behind that modern excavators still wince at today. Whole paintings judged not good enough for the Royal Museum were, by some accounts, deliberately destroyed, so they could not compete with or dilute its prestige. The German scholar Johann Joachim Winckelmann, often called the father of modern art history, visited these excavations in person during the 1750s and 60s. He wrote sharply critical letters about the secrecy and the destruction he witnessed firsthand. Letters that helped push the wider practice of archaeology toward the more careful methods we now take for granted. Judged as science, the early digging was closer to vandalism. Judged as spectacle, it detonated across Europe anyway. Engravings of the finds circulated everywhere. The Grand Tour, that finishing school of the European elite, bent its whole itinerary southward, because here you could climb down a ladder and stand physically inside the ancient world, instead of only imagining it from a book. The style of the finds fed painters, potters, furniture makers, and architects across the continent, and scholars often credit the twin-buried cities with helping ignite the entire neoclassical movement. A dead town was quietly redecorating the drawing rooms of Europe. Still, the digging remained. At its core, a hunt for objects. What finally changed that was Italy itself. As the peninsula unified into a single kingdom, the excavations passed in 1863 into the hands of a scholar named Giuseppe Fiorelli. And Fiorelli did something genuinely radical. He decided the city itself, not the treasure buried inside it, was the actual point. He divided Pompeii into the numbered regions and blocks that archaeologists still use to name every single doorway today. He insisted on clearing houses from the top down, floor by floor. Instead of tunneling blindly through their walls, he kept careful, systematic records for the first time, and he opened the site to the paying public. And in that same year, 1863, his workers reported something in the ash layer that an entire century of treasure hunters had broken straight through without a second thought. Hollow spaces, with bones inside them. Fiorelli recognized at once what those hollows actually represented, and gave the order that changed how the whole world would eventually see this place. Pour liquid plaster carefully into the empty voids. Let it fully set. Then chip the hardened ash away from around it. What emerged was no longer archaeology in any comfortable sense of the word. A man lying face down, head resting on his own folded arms. Adults curled protectively around smaller forms beside them. The folds of real clothing, the straps of actual sandals, and in some casts, contours of the face that later viewers have read as fear, or effort, or pain. How much of that reading is genuinely preserved in the plaster? and how much is simply our own projection onto it. Specialists still discuss and debate, since ash moulding, decay, and the casting process itself each shape the final result in ways that are hard to fully separate. What is beyond any real dispute is what those casts did to the meaning of Pompeii overnight. Europe had already spent 100 years admiring this city's artwork from a comfortable distance. Now the city looked back. After the casts, Pompeii could never again be treated as simply a mine of beautiful things. It had become the scene of a genuine human event, preserved right down to the position of a single hand, and it raised the exact question that has driven the science ever since. The same question the next chapter tries honestly to answer. If the ash kept this much, what else did it manage to keep? Chapter 12. What Pompeii Told Us. The title of this video makes a fairly large promise. The city that died in one day told us everything. So let me be honest about that word before we try to cash the check it wrote. Not literally everything. No single site on Earth could manage that. But Pompeii, together with its buried neighbours along this coast, has preserved more of ordinary Roman daily life than almost anywhere else in the empire. And the gap between it and the runner-up is not remotely close. Here is what that claim actually means in practice. Start with the smallest things, because that is exactly where this site remains unbeatable. The historians of Rome tell us what emperors and senators did. Pompeii tells us what everyone ate. Carbonized loaves have come out of these ovens still whole, still scored into 8 wedges, exactly as they went in. One famous loaf from neighbouring Herculaneum even carries a stamp pressed into the dough before baking, naming a man called Sila, slave of Quintus Granius Verus, so that a shared communal oven would never confuse whose bread belonged to whom. A property mark on a loaf of bread, naming an enslaved man from the 1st century, and beneath one street of Herculaneum, researchers excavated something gloriously unglamorous, a sewer that had quietly collected the everyday waste of the apartments above it for years. From its contents they reconstructed a working-class diet rich in fish, olives, figs, eggs, and grain, seasoned, of course, with that same famous fish sauce. We have, in effect, the shopping list of ordinary Romans. No surviving text could ever have given us that. We know their medicine. A building excavators simply call the house of the surgeon yielded a full professional kit. Scalpels, probes, forceps, bone levers, instruments whose basic shapes a working surgeon today would still recognize on the tray without much explanation. We know their gardens, because the same ash that moulded human bodies also moulded tree roots and vine stakes with equal precision. And botanists have since replanted several ancient plots with the very same species that grew there 2,000 years ago. We know their prices, their rental terms, their loan interest rates, their insults, their private prayers. This is exactly what I mean when I say Pompeii is not a ruin. It is a database, and that database is still actively growing, because roughly a third of the ancient city remains entirely unexcavated, and the past several years have brought the most spectacular digging in living memory. Since 2018, work in the Regio 5 district has produced the charcoal date that reopened the eruption calendar, the painted snack bar with its menu still sitting in the jars, and frescoes so fresh they genuinely look wet in photographs. In 2023, the Archaeological Park announced a fresco showing a round flatbread topped with fruit, and the world's press, with the park's own amused tolerance, immediately called it the ancestor of pizza, though tomatoes themselves would not reach Italy for another 15 centuries. That same year brought a considerably grimmer find. A cramped bakery where the milling appears to have been done by enslaved workers and animals together, in a space fitted with barred windows. A hard reminder of exactly what powered this charming city day to day. In 2024 came a banquet hall with dramatic black-painted walls and scenes from the Trojan War. In 2025, a large private bath complex attached to a grand house, big enough to pamper dozens of guests at a single gathering. Every few months, this dead city somehow finds a way to hold another press conference. Then science turned its attention to the victims themselves, and Pompeii did something almost no other historical site is able to do. It corrected its own legends. In 2022, researchers published what they described as the first complete genome ever sequenced from a Pompeii victim, a man found inside the house of the craftsman, whose bones also carried clear signs of tuberculosis, a disease closely associated with crowded urban living. Then, in 2024, a study in the journal Current Biology reported new DNA recovered from several of the famous plaster casts. And the results overturned stories that had been told to visitors for generations. A cast long presented to tourists as a mother holding her child turned out to be an adult male, entirely unrelated to the child beside him, a pair locked in an embrace, romanticized for decades as sisters, or as mother and daughter, included at least one man. For well over a century, the world had been reading these frozen bodies through its own comfortable assumptions about family. The DNA politely, firmly disagreed, and that same research confirmed something the graffiti and the busy harbour had already hinted at strongly. Pompeii's people were genetically diverse, with strong ancestry connections running across the entire eastern Mediterranean. This small, ordinary Italian town was, in the fullest sense, a port city of the whole Roman Sea, which brings us to the discovery that may eventually outgrow every other one on this list. And it is unfolding right now, in real time. It concerns the one kind of treasure everyone had long assumed was lost forever. Books. Here I owe you a small clarification first. Pompeii itself preserved no great library of its own, but a few miles away, its sister city Herculaneum preserved something Pompeii simply could not. In the 1750s, Bourbon tunnellers broke into a seaside villa there and found hundreds upon hundreds of papyrus scrolls, the only large library to survive intact from the entire ancient world. There was one serious problem. The eruption's heat had carbonized every scroll into a fragile black cylinder, and for 2.5 centuries, nearly every physical attempt to open one destroyed it in the process. Knowledge sealed inside a locked safe, with no working key. The key eventually turned out to be software. A research team led by the computer scientist Brent Seals spent years developing methods to scan the scrolls with high-energy imaging and then unroll them virtually, entirely inside a computer, without ever touching the fragile object itself. In 2023, this work became a global competition called the Vesuvius Challenge, offering substantial prize money to any team that could teach machine learning to make the invisible ink visible. Within months, a student read a first whole word from inside a scroll that had never once been physically opened. The word was Greek, and it meant purple. By 2024, competitors had recovered entire columns of continuous text, passages of Greek philosophy on pleasure, music, and food, most likely from the circle of the Epicurean philosopher Philodemus. Then, in June of 2026, The project announced its biggest result yet, and the full story behind it makes the result even more remarkable. One particular scroll, catalogued as P-Herc 1667 and known within the community as Scroll 4, had already been through 3 failed physical openings across history, once in the 1800s, once in 1969, and once again in the 1980s. Each attempt destroyed more of the original roll. By the time those efforts stopped, less than half of the scroll survived at all, compressed into a small, damaged core. This time, nobody touched it. Researchers scanned that surviving core with high-energy imaging and unrolled it entirely inside a computer. They recovered roughly 22 columns of continuous Greek text, the complete preserved portion of the scroll, read straight through for the first time. It turned out to hold a different kind of writing than the earlier finds, an ethical treatise whose language and themes place it in the Stoic tradition rather than the Epicurean circle of the earlier discoveries. In the very same announcement, the team also confirmed the original 2023 prize-winning reading at a much higher resolution, and recovered a title from a separate third scroll. That title identified the work as Philodemus, On Gods, Book 8, extending a text previously known from only its first volume to at least 8 books in total. The project has now moved from single fragments and isolated columns toward the goal of reading complete surviving scrolls, one after another, out of the hundreds that remain sealed. Understand what is actually at stake here. Most of ancient literature is already lost forever. What survived did so only by being copied, by hand, generation after generation, for well over 1,000 years, and everything that missed that slow lifeboat simply drowned in time. If this virtual unrolling keeps working at scale, entire texts that no human being has read since the Roman Empire itself may genuinely come back from the dead. The eruption of 79 AD would then hold the strangest legacy in recorded history. It destroyed 2 cities, and in the very act of destroying them, it accidentally saved their books. So the promise holds, honestly stated at last: streets, food, medicine, gardens, elections, handwriting, family, dinner, and now, quite possibly, literature itself. One buried coastline. Read patiently for nearly 3 centuries and counting, has given us the texture of Roman life the way almost nowhere else on earth can. There is one part of this story left, and it is the one part that is not history yet. The machine that preserved all of this is still switched on. Chapter 13. The mountain is still there. Drive south from Naples today, and the mountain rides your window the whole way. Green and calm and almost gentle, much as it must have looked to those first Oscan farmers 3,000 years ago. That resemblance should give you real pause. It reassured them too. Let us be clear about what Vesuvius has actually done since 79 AD, because that great eruption was never a farewell. The mountain has erupted many times since, and some of those eruptions were genuine killers. In 1631, a violent awakening devastated the towns on its slopes, killed thousands of people, and once again sent burning flows racing toward the sea. Through the 17, 18, and 1900s, it flared often enough that a steady glow over Vesuvius was simply part of the ordinary Naples night, a spectacle for painters and early tourists alike. The most recent eruption came in March of 1944, in the middle of the Second World War, when lava buried villages on the slopes and ashfall damaged dozens of Allied warplanes parked at an airfield near Of all possible places, Pompeii itself. Soldiers on leave photographed the eruption between combat missions. Then, finally, the mountain went quiet. It has now been quiet for more than 80 years. And volcanologists will tell you plainly that quiet is not the same thing as safe. This stands as one of the longest pauses in the volcano's well-documented recent history. And scientists do not simply assume that the next eruption will resemble the smaller, gentler events of the past few centuries. The deep system beneath the mountain has not gone anywhere at all. Vesuvius remains one of the most closely watched and most genuinely dangerous volcanoes on Earth. The danger lies less in the mountain's raw power than in the sheer number of its neighbors. One number closes this story exactly where it began, with people choosing fertile ground without fully understanding what sat beneath it. Roughly 700,000 people live today inside the official red zone, spread across 25 separate municipalities in the provinces of Naples and Salerno. The area authorities judge could realistically be reached by future pyroclastic flows. A wider yellow zone, covering dozens more municipalities and parts of Naples itself, faces the separate risk of heavy ashfall. Around all of it spreads the greater metropolitan area of Naples, home to some 3 million people in total. The suburbs have climbed the volcano itself over the decades. Entire apartment blocks now stand on top of the lava field from 1944. By any reasonable measure, this is one of the largest populations anywhere in the world living directly in the shadow of an active volcano, and nearly every family there has made, mostly without ever putting it into so many words, the same quiet bet the Oscans made 3,000 years earlier. The ground is good. The mountain has been calm for as long as anyone can remember. The real difference, this time, is that the mountain is actually being listened to. On its slopes sits the Vesuvius Observatory. Founded in 1841, it is widely honored as the oldest volcano observatory anywhere in the world. Today it sits at the operational heart of a dense network of seismometers, ground deformation sensors, gas monitors, and satellites, all of them attending to the volcano every single second of every single day without pause. Italian civil protection authorities maintain a formal, detailed emergency plan built on that continuous science. The plan hinges on a specific moment, the declaration of what is called the alarm phase. Once that phase is officially declared, the red zone is meant to be evacuated within a maximum of roughly 72 hours. Hundreds of thousands of people would be moved out by road, rail, and sea. Each of the 25 municipalities has been twinned years in advance with a specific host region elsewhere in Italy, arranged to receive its own evacuees. Whether the warning signs will arrive cleanly enough, and whether the plan itself will run as smoothly on the day as it does on paper, the experts themselves openly debate. What nobody debates is why such a detailed plan exists at all. It exists because science slowly learned, layer by layer, exactly what this particular mountain is capable of doing. Within that body of science, sitting quietly alongside the deposits and the models and the instruments, are two letters written to a historian by a man who watched the whole thing unfold as a teenager. Pliny's account remains one of the earliest and most influential observational records ever used to reconstruct what a long sleeping mountain can actually do when it finally wakes. That may be the final gift of the city that died. Pompeii is a large part of the reason humanity now takes quiet volcanoes seriously at all. The monitoring network strung across dozens of dangerous peaks around the world today, the evacuation drills, the very scientific vocabulary used to describe the worst eruptions on the planet. All of it stands in a direct line of knowledge that runs back to that October, or August, day, 19 centuries ago. So let us end exactly where we started, in the bakery, at the oven that was never opened again. 81 loaves, scored into 8 wedges each. Whoever placed them there was not living inside a tragedy. To that person, it was simply a working day, in a rebuilding city, in a growing empire, beneath a mountain that had been quiet for as long as anyone could remember. There was bread to bake, there were accounts to settle, and there was every ordinary reason in the world to expect tomorrow. That, in the end, is what Pompeii told us. It is the thing underneath the frescoes, and the DNA, and the unread scrolls. Not that the Romans were like us, that they were us. Same bread, same traffic, same jokes scratched onto the same kind of walls, same keys carried toward doors that would never open again, same certainty, right up until the end, that ordinary life is permanent. The people of Pompeii did not know they were living through the last days of their city. Nobody ever does. What remains of them asks us only one thing in return. The question sealed inside that oven, along with the bread. What are you sure of? Standing on your own quiet ground. Thank you for watching, and for standing here with them for a while.